Hello, I'm Erika Mallin, Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Arts Program. Welcome to our conversation on theater and the American narrative. In this conversation, in light of the reckoning we are having in our nation between our past and our future, we ask how theater can help us tell a fully American story, one that is more inclusive and can cross the lines that divide us. To help us explore this question, we are so pleased to have Oskar Eustis, Artistic Director of the Public Theater, and our Harman Eisner Artist in Residence, and Shanta Thake, Associate Director at the Public Theater, in conversation with Eric Liu, my esteemed colleague and Executive Director of the Institute's Citizenship and American Identity Program, and the founder of Citizen University. I also want to thank Jane Harman and Michael and Jane Eisner for their support of the Artist in Residence program, and Mary Mochary for her support of the arts program, making panels like these possible. So with my sincere thanks to our panelists, I will now turn it over to you, Eric.
Thank you so much, Erika. It's great to be part of this whole Harman Eisner wonderful extravaganza of conversation. And I want to have Oskar and Shanta join us here in the room. Hello, Oskar. Hello, Shanta.
Hello, Eric.
Great to be with you both. We're going to have a conversation here, as Erika said, that is partly about what it takes right now to make a new story of us. The thing that I really want to begin with is this idea of responsibility. The question that I have for you in your roles at the Public Theater, but also by extension, your roles in the American cultural scene right now, what does it mean for an artist to take responsibility right now for a new American story? How do you interpret that idea? Do you reject the premise outright? Do you think, I'm just curious, how does that land with you in your work as artists and as leaders of an arts institution? And Shanta, actually, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Erika. I think an artist always thinks of that as part of their responsibility. I think the question for us at the public and personally is how do we support artists in a way that will allow them to have those stories told in a world, in this COVID and then post-COVID world, where they are truly struggling more than they ever have, where all support networks have been taken out from under them, and the sort of laid bare the idea that they didn't have any support networks to begin with, or very few for our artist class. So I think that responsibility, artists hold all the time. I think that's a deep part of most of the artists, certainly the artists that we work with regularly hold, in terms of reflecting and refracting the American experience or their experience as individuals. And I think the question right now for us is how do we make sure that there is a pathway, not just for those stories to be told, for their individual work to be seen and heard, but also just for them to be able to make a life in this country. So I think that responsibility for us has become even more clear in this time.
I want to come back to that notion of even your institutional responsibility to artists, but Oskar, I want to get a sense from you of just how you respond to this idea of taking responsibility for a new American story right now.
Well, I think it's crucial. It's crucial for the arts, it's crucial for the institutions. And part of what we are being forced to reckon with is that the divisions in this country are way deeper, way more firmly entrenched, and increasing in a way that's just unavoidable now. People have tried to dance around it for a long time, whether those are racial divisions, economic divisions, geographical divisions, ideological divisions. They are deep and growing deeper. So part of what I think we have to think about as institutions is how do we, as artistic institutions, is how do we become part of the knitting together of a nation that feels increasingly siloed and polarized? How can we be the anti-internet? How can we be a force that isn't about letting people exist in their own echo chambers, but reaching out of their echo chambers and recognize their commonality. And you can't do that unless everybody has a voice. So the first thing you've got to do is make sure everybody gets to talk and tell their own story. And then you have to figure out how do they reach out of their silo and have that story heard and appreciated by people who aren't like them on the streets.
You saw me smile when you said the anti-internet, which I think hashtag anti-internet. That's our takeaway for theater in general right now. But I am curious in particular because what you said after that also reveals sort of the inherent tension when we talk about art and democracy. You said that everybody has to be able to have their voice heard and everybody has to have their story told. One might say on the pro-internet camp that's precisely what the internet does, and the internet enables people who who'd been kept out by gatekeepers of various kinds to actually not only have their voices heard, but to create their own self-enclosed worlds and stories of what the world is. QAnon maybe being the most notorious such example, but there are plenty less noxious comparable examples across the ideological spectrum right now. And so I want to home in on this particular idea of how do we, once we create a space, set a tone, create a practice, a cultural practice of indeed trying democratically to have everyone's voice be heard, that pivot point that you alluded to then of, okay, then how do we synthesize that? How do we make sense of that? How do we knit that in a way that weaves, how do we do that in a way that actually doesn't just recreate cacophony, right? And I'm curious, either of you, your thoughts on that next pivot then.
Shanta?
Well, I hesitate to start, but I think, it's hard because America is a multivalent story. There's so many perspectives that have to be part. I think what, perhaps what I think we've missed in this time is this opportunity to sit in a room and listen together, and this way of listening across bodies in a room with other humans to a narrative that's complicated, that complicates our idea of what it means to be American, of what it means if we thought a certain thing, if we perceive these humans on stage in a certain way, and they start to play with that. And then you're experiencing that at the same time as the people in the audience. I keep saying the thing I miss the most in this time that I have felt, although I've really enjoyed the benefits of what it means to do our work in a way that is accessible over the internet, I have missed being an audience member. And I think those skills of how we listen to one another, those are grown over time. And I think the more we stay in our boxes, in our apartments, staring at screens, we sort of lose the nuance of what it means to be experiencing things with other people. And that I think is part of how to experience complicated narratives in a way that allows you to make them a little bit more human.
As usual, Shanta has hit it right on the head, because we're talking about the theater now, not about all art. And in the theater, the audience is the essential component. You can't have a work of theater without an audience. And where else in our culture right now can people who don't already share ideological beliefs gather together to have profound emotional, intellectual experiences? It's not in our churches, where we've already siloed. It's not in our political parties. And most of our civic institutions are not providing that service anymore. One way that I illustrate this is what made Shakespeare the greatest writer in the history of the English language. It wasn't his talent, it was his audience. For the first time, an English writer was having to speak to an audience that consisted of all classes, from illiterate groundlings to Cambridge graduates to the royalty. And because he had to speak to everybody at once, he had to tell a story in which they all recognized themselves, which meant that in watching that, they were actually forged into a sense of their own unity. And that's why not just who we let speak on stage, but who they're speaking to, who we reach with this work, is an integral part of the theater filling its democratic function.
So there are several points I want to pick up here. I mean, I think Shanta, when you describe these, in a sense, skills of citizenship, the listening, the awareness of not only what's happening on stage, but what's happening in the room around you. You know, many of your earlier years at the Public, you cut your teeth at Joe's Pub, and you know, that cabaret space, which by definition, you know, the audience is not only passive, the audience is participatory in a way that may be less so in more traditional play watching settings. And so that idea of listening, not only the, you know, coupled with, Oskar, what you're saying, the kind of the synthesis that happens when a Shakespeare himself, as an artist, does that deep listening. The thing that I want to point out here is that there's an implicit element in both of these things you're pointing out, both the skills of listening and the power of a synthesizer like Shakespeare, and that is common knowledge, an assumption that we share some common knowledge, right? The most obvious of which might be the English language. We're all speaking a version of the language that we all can recognize, even if in dialect or in format or in Hamilton or in something else, it is delivered in a way that may not be in your daily comfort zone. But again, the fragmentation of our society right now is such that common knowledge is getting harder and harder to come by, right? And so when you said, Shanta, that we have multivalent stories, that perhaps actually the premise of my whole question is wrong. There is no story of us, right? There's only lots and lots of stories of us. I personally don't actually agree with that. I do think there is a transcendent synthesizing story, but I am curious, in a world where we are truly in a multiplicity, a multivalent set of stories, how do we create common knowledge? And is theater the last best institution to try actually to do that, when so many of our other public, artistic, other civic institutions are, as you said, Oskar, checked out of that mission?
Well, just starting for a second, I think you can see some of this in what Ibram X. Kendi has taught us, or Jill Lepore in These Truths, that these separate strands are actually one strand. I was very used to thinking of America as being founded on a contradiction. On the one hand, it was about freedom and democracy, and on the other hand, it was a society founded on genocide and racism. What Lepore and Kendi show us is those two things, the freedom and the slavery, were interdependent from the beginning. The freedom only existed because the slavery existed. And that's the promise of giving voice to many different storytellers. That out of many different storytellers, you begin to see how those stories interrelate and don't exist independently of each other. And I know that for many, many Americans, it's what August Wilson succeeded at, basically telling the story of America in the 20th century through Black people in Pittsburgh. And by doing that, because all art has to have an address, that's what makes it specific, he actually made millions of other people recognize themselves in that story, or recognize their relationship to that story. And that's what a great storyteller does, is not simply tell their story, but tell their story deeply enough that many people can see themselves as part of it or reflected in it.
Shanta, this idea of we're founded on a contradiction, and there is a synthesis inherent in that there's an interdependence between freedom and slavery. I think so much of what is happening right now in cultural institutions around the country is that a rising generation of people who have grown up in a United States that is far more diverse, that starts as its baseline, not accepting that whiteness and Americanness should be synonymous in perpetuity, is coming to the fore, and you are an embodiment of this shift. How, just when you think generationally, within the arts world or within the theater world, what is the appetite for being comfortable with that contradiction, with the implicit unum that comes from fusing together freedom and slavery? Or do you feel like generationally there's like, no, that's old generation talk, that's too aspirational, and we're dealing with the reality of promises betrayed here, left and right? I'm curious your kind of generational take on this.
I'm not sure. I think I would land somewhere in a deep distrust for the narrative that has been the dominant narrative for so long, and really feeling like this narrative of what is America had nothing to offer me, or was in fact setting up, has been the same narrative for too long, way too long. And even though we think of there having been multiple narratives that have come and gone, that I think we're seeing what has been, a 400-plus-year-old narrative continue to rear its head, and feel like, how can we trust in anything coming at us that says, I think you said, I keep this phrase that you used, Eric, of this frame of permission that, our former president gave our country in terms of racism towards Asian Americans. And this frame of permission that we've sort of built America within, our educational systems and all of these structures. So I think there's a deep distrust in what is this American narrative, and what is our own power to take that back and infuse something that actually feels connected to power. And so yeah, I'm still wrestling with all of those things. I think I will be probably for the rest of my life, but what I hope is that this other side of the American narrative can be attached to power, can be walked alongside in the rest of this very broken frame we have, to really bring these new narratives into the light with real power, and let some other narratives step back a little bit.
I'm so glad you brought explicitly the idea and the notion of power into the conversation. We all collaborated pretty early in the start of the Trump administration in doing a program that we started at Citizen University called Civic Saturdays, which, Oskar, when you talk about how churches and other civic spaces don't invite folks of different backgrounds into a common space for shared sense making, that was precisely the idea behind Civic Saturday, to create a civic analog to a faith gathering, and to have it have the arc and the flow and the feel with song and poetry and texts of what you might think of as civic scripture that challenge us to face the facts and the hypocrisy of the facts of our past. And we did that at Joe's Pub to great effect. And what I remember most about that day, it happened to have been also the day of a great deal of protest around the country. I think it was probably fairly early, as I say, in the early weeks of the administration. But part of what really struck me that day, at heightened moments like that, Americans, who usually are a pretty ahistorical people, to put it nicely, right? Americans generally have no memory beyond a couple of seasons of TV shows, or nowadays, yesterday's Twitter feed, that in heightened moments like that, Americans are really open to seeing themselves in a long continuum of history and understanding how this is either a recapitulation of a cycle or a deeper reckoning with things left unreckoned with in the past. And so one source of power is just knowing our history, knowing and claiming memory in a way, right? And so our one form, and I think about, of course, Sweat, Lynn Nottage's very recent history, set in Pennsylvania, Rust Belt, Pennsylvania. But before we got going, I showed you, I'd pulled off the shelf my copy of Susan Laurie Parks's Father Comes Home from the Wars, parts 1, 2, and 3. Just this radically creative reimagining of how to, Toni Morrison's word, rememory, how to have a memory of a memory, right? About slavery and Civil War and so forth. And are you tempted in this time right now to be creating and producing and showing works that are not actually set in contemporary times or recent times, but really kind of yank us back to the past to help us see ourselves more clearly because of the power inherent in grappling with memory?
One of the major things we do is Shakespeare in the Park, Eric. And by its definition, when we do Shakespeare in the Park, we have a historical text colliding with a performance that is exactly in this moment. And it's the collision between what Shakespeare was writing then and 400 years later, how we're producing it, that produces the excitement. It produces the electricity, it produces the sparks. So that's every summer at the center of our practice. Shows like Hamilton or like Father Comes Home from the Wars, I think actually help reformulate what our narrative is. They're doing the work that Shanta describes of taking a narrative that has been one way in which certain people are subjects and certain people are objects, and it's flipping it and saying people get to be the subjects of their own history. And that act, the theater, I think, is particularly good at. We use terms in colloquial language to put the spotlight on someone, to put them center stage. And we literally do that. We literally put people center stage. And again, what you notice there is the audience is completely implied in that. It's not just that they get to stand in a certain place or they get to have a light on them. It's they get to be seen. And when we put people who, when Clifford Odets put tenement Jews on Broadway stages, as Alfred Kazin said, living there with as much right as if they were Hamlet or Lear. We're elevating people's experience and saying, it's not just your experience, it's your experience that we need to take seriously. It's your experience that, as Shanta says, we need to listen to. And that is, I believe in that act.
Oscar, we, public Aspen Arts Program, Citizen University have collaborated over the years with the Kennedy Center in something called the Arts Summit. Every year the emphasis there is on trying to popularize this idea of the citizen artist. And when we talk about citizen artists and citizen artistry, I think a lot of people focus on one direction of that flow, which is the artist as citizen, right? The artist as someone who has what we spoke about at the beginning of this conversation, responsibilities to engage the conflicts and the issues and the moral choices of the time. But I'm interested to hear your reflections on the other direction, the citizen as artist, the everyday American who may not call herself or himself an artist, or probably because this is the way most people are, would quickly disavow, oh, I'm not a creative type, I'm not an imaginative person. And yet, so much of what you both have been describing here for audiences and participants in theater is not just listening. I mean, it is co-creation of a sort, right? And when you take those skills into the rest of the norms we abide or contribute to, co-create a sense of what's okay in society. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts just on what it takes for more citizens to open up to the ways in which their lives are a form of art, their way of moving in civic life, not least in a city like New York, but anywhere. It could be in a small town like Brownsville, Minnesota, are a form of art as well. Can you say something about that?
Sure, but I think that it presupposes something that has been a relatively recent discovery for me, and that is that we have done damage by fully professionalizing our arts and our arts culture. The idea that artistry is something to be done by professionals, by trained elites, as opposed to, and this is a learning that I have from Laurie Woolery, Lear de Bessonet, the extraordinary people who run a public works program, that artistry is inherent in every human being, that every human being has the need, the desire, the ability to express themselves artistically. And we're just on a scale like everybody else. Some of us get to practice it more often than others. And so we get more skilled at it. We're privileged to have that. But it's not something that separates us from our audience. It's something that actually, so once you start blurring the lines and you say, the point about theater is not what's going to happen to the professional theater. It's what's going to happen to America when theater maximizes its role in creating a society. And that includes community theater and amateur theater and programs like public works that mix professionals and amateurs and incredibly skilled performers and people who are just on stage for the first time. And the democratic energy that unleashes every summer in the 2,000-seat Delacorte is unmistakable. It's proof of concept. It's not just a great social work program. It's the best art we make. And it's something, you were asking Shanta about generational differences. Well, let me tell you a generational difference I feel from Shanta is that Shanta has an ease in crossing boundaries. She goes from music to theater to humanities programs to religion. And I watch her connect all of those in a way that, to me, I mean, it's partly Shanta's so great, but it's also that generationally she's better at than I am. She's more fluid about the. I tend to be a little more locked into categories. And it's been a hugely exciting adventure for me, although sometimes scary, to try and get out of my silo and try to start to, again, crossing boundaries is how art gets made. The collision of opposites is what creates drama. So we just got to keep doing it.
The only thing I would just want to say in terms of the question of citizen artist and artist as citizen is that it also requires that we value the arts in our society, and I don't think that holds across our great country. And in order for people to really want to participate, to feel like it should be a part of everyone's life to not only see art, which many people don't get the opportunity to do, but also to participate in some way without feeling like it is something separate and such a privilege that they should not feel so frivolous, be a part of. And we have made the arts so separated from everyday life in our country. And I think we almost have the distinction of doing that. In so many other cultures, art remains at the center of how you show up in public space. And I think that separation has really, really driven such a wedge between so many of us. And to increase the actual value, and I do mean money as well as prestige in our society, and give it the placement that it deserves, so that there is something to really look at and revere and want to be a part of and understand how it connects to your life, is something that I think really needs to be invested in.
I wanted to tie a couple threads together here around the awakenings that are possible when people participate democratically, as you're both saying, in the experience of theater. I know that for different shows of yours, and I know most directly from having been involved a little bit with it, that when after Sweat left your stage, you all as an institution worked to not only help it travel to other parts of the country, but also to create a somewhat immersive learning experience that supplemented the show itself, right? And I guess the question that's been running through my mind as we've been talking about here, through all the works, past and present shows, old standbys like Shakespeare in the Park or newer work, is in this time right now, how much do you want to let an audience, trust that an audience will take in, learn, be moved, be provoked in the ways that you hope they would be? And how much do you feel like actually in this heightened moment right now, we have a slightly extra obligation to be slightly more intentional about, if I may use this word, and you may ban it, like forever, pedagogy. Like, is there, without being pedantic, should we be pointing people a little bit more to the questions that are being forced to the surface here, so that they can then carry some of those conversations with more skill into the rest of their lives as citizens or artists? What is your take on that? Kind of boils down to, like, how heavy-handed do you want to be about, raising questions and giving people lessons to think about from the art?
I feel like I could channel Shanta here. She could know, and I've heard her talk about this so eloquently, which is instead of talking about pedagogy, talk about relationships. Talk about we have to double down on investing in the relationships we have with our audience. And when you do that, learning flows from it, but it's not defined by the hierarchy of we have knowledge that you don't. It's a mutual relationship that forms bonds between us. I've always been very heavy-handed in my artistry. I completely believe in, complex, disturbing, and messianic messaging in an art. But not all theater is like that. Not all theater needs to be like that. But what all theater needs to do is thrive off a vital two-way relationship between artist and audience. That has to happen. So a lot of what I think we're looking to when we come back from this pandemic is how do we thicken our ties to the audience? How do we listen more to them? Not focus groups, but to their hearts and dreams and aspirations.
Yeah, I would say, the conversation that we're having around relationship building and learning instead of pedagogy is, but pedagogy obviously being a part of that, like how do we define learning as the public? What do we want to learn about our community in order to do the best work? What does our community want to learn or is asking for in relationship with us that we think we can bring some artists to that table and have that conversation? So I think investing in a community means investing in the whole community, and that means individuals at every age, where they are in that journey and how we want to show up for families, for seniors. And I think we've been in that conversation for a long time, but we're at the beginning of it for some of those pieces, and so we have a lot to learn.
I want to close with this observation that in different settings you both have talked about many times that it is no accident that theater and democracy emerged around the same time in similar ways in ancient Greece, and that they both involve similar almost magical awakenings of a sense of collective voice and power through acts of group co-creation. But what I want to say in particular is that what is true of theater and democracy in general is especially true about the life and the work of the public theater. And the way that you are doing that work, the way that you both have been describing the work is, to me, exhibit A of what it means to think about theater as democracy, democracy as theater, and trusting that the more people you bring in, the better it's going to be. And that faith is one that is in short supply in a lot of institutions in the United States right now. And so the work that you're doing and the work that the public stands for is so important and necessary. Oskar Eustis, Shanta Thake, thank you so much. Oskar, I know you're the Harman Eisner artist in residence, but I will call you today both citizens in residence for being such great examples of how to practice democracy creatively for the good of all.